Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and thank you very much to the organizers for organizing this very, very important meeting, and I hope there will be more meetings in the near future. That's exactly what we need. We need to make our voices heard in the public debate to overcome the current paradigm. I had the occasion to work at various times in the past in Africa, in Malawi, in Tanzania and Uganda, and I had a chance, among others, to work in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology in Kampala, where the HIF-NET-12 study was done. I was not involved in that study. I was all my work in Africa was focusing on obstetrics and gynecology and maternal mortality, but I did obviously research this topic extensively. When we discuss the lack of or the non-existence of an epidemic in developed countries, North America and Europe, people have to concede that there is no epidemic, as we have been told for the last 20 years. But then frequently we come to this question, now, but what's about Africa? The fantasy is now, okay, we have to admit there is no epidemic in Europe, but what's about Africa? Isn't there kind of, don't we see this epidemic and the devastation that goes along with a deadly epidemic? So I would like to share with you some data and some experiences on this topic. I will first go through some findings which have been published at the beginning of the so-called AIDS epidemic. I will then discuss some predictions, present some of the predictions and discuss underlying assumptions. I will then compare the findings of today and with the predictions of the past, and give some explanations on these contradictions. And then at the end, I would like to focus a little bit on how we can help people in Africa. I'm convinced they need our help. Now, why Uganda? If you remember, at the very beginning of the so-called AIDS pandemic, Uganda was claimed to be the epicenter of the pandemic, and this is shown in this statistics, in this graph from UNAIDS at that time, where you see Uganda, the spot in the middle, the red spot, just above Lake Victoria, with the highest HIV prevalence, indicating that's where everything originated, at the shores of Lake Victoria. That's kind of where everything started. And you see this statistic is from 1987, so now we are more than 20 years later, and I think this is an ideal study case to see what's going on there, how did this epidemic affect the country. Now, I'm going to present you some of the comments of the past. This is what was said in the New England Journal of Medicine. AIDS is already the most common cause of admission and death among hospitalized adults. In many parts of the country, 1 million adults out of a country of 17 million people are estimated to be HIV positive and understood to be doomed to premature death. 1 million out of 17 million. Quite impressive, quite a number. And similarly, UNAIDS said already 50% of beds in hospitals in Uganda are occupied by people with HIV. If that's really true, that will have a serious effect in history, and you would probably be able to claim this is unprecedented in human history. Now, these news were based or came on what we already believed to know about Africa, and I think this Newsweek title story from 1984 summed up very nicely what we believed about Africa. Well, can it be saved at all? But not only Africa, in the title, in the issue, they become more precise. They specify, can Black Africa be saved? And I never understood why people would call Africa Black Africa, because if there is a color, if you go to Africa and there's one dominant color, it's red. It is the red continent. It is not the black continent. But obviously the color black fits better to what we think to know about Africa. So from the very beginning, even before AIDS started, there was this belief that actually Africa is doomed to disaster. And then AIDS came on top of that, and nothing else, experts predicted nothing else than global devastation due to HIV/AIDS. Just global devastation. And concerning the economics, obviously, I mean, if you think about global devastation, then the consequences of AIDS stand up to undermine all efforts to promote development in Africa. So that's virtually the end of history, that what we were made to believe in Africa. And why all that? And Charles Geshechter talked about very nicely about it. And I would just like to cite Dr. Peter Piot, who had been the head of UNAIDS for many, many years. And he said it very clearly: multi-partner sexual behavior deeply rooted in polygamous African societies. So it's their own fault, isn't it? Now, it's quite interesting that Dr. Peter Piot, actually being a doctor, a medical doctor, he changed 2 years ago. He left UNAIDS, and now he's chairman of the King Buddha Foundation in Brussels, in Belgium. It's quite interesting to see that this mission statement of this royal society is to make a lasting contribution towards greater justice, democracy, and respect for diversity. Now, I never understood monarchy at all, but to claim that a monarchy is striving for greater justice and democracy seems to be a little bit contradictory to me. And I wonder what a medical doctor would do in the 21st century in a royal foundation in a leading position. Just to give you some background. Now, all these informations which we had been hearing for the last 20 years and more were based on several assumptions, and I just listed them here. And the assumptions, as we heard from Charles Geshechter already, that sexuality of Africans is different, and by different meaning obviously more. HIV is widely transmitted sexually in Africa, as in contrast to Europe and North America. HIV tests would be reliable in diagnosing infection. HIV invariably leads to AIDS. AIDS invariably leads to premature death. And the only solution, so to say, is ARVs. That's what we are made to believe. These are the underlying assumptions, and I will go through a few of them. Now, is there really a deadly epidemic in Uganda? Again, some citations from the government of Uganda and a website, avert.org, who summed it up very nicely. HIV prevalence was about 15% of all adults. So you imagine 15% of the population of Uganda was doomed to premature death, period. Quite an impressive development if that was true. And as a consequence, the government admitted that by early 90s, large part of the HIV-infected population has succumbed to the opportunistic infections. AIDS epidemic has killed approximately 1 million people. And the reason so many people died was the lack of treatment. Now, if you look at the population, at the total number of population, you come up with a very interesting figure. At the right side is the result of the census, which is done every 10 years. And you can see quite an impressive, actually very impressive increase of the population during the AIDS era, with an annual population growth of 3.4. Now, you may think 3.4 is not very much, but I can tell you 3.4 is the highest, among the highest population growth rates you can find on Earth. And actually, if you look a little bit further back in history, you can see that population growth rate, annual population growth rate, has actually increased, significantly increased during the AIDS era. So it is safe to say that this so-called deadly epidemic in Uganda paralleled a significant and actually quite a dangerous increase in population growth rate. Quite inconsistent with a deadly epidemic, and it would be the first deadly epidemic in human history leading to a population growth rate. And this is not only true for Uganda, but also for the whole of Africa. the biggest problem of Africa currently is the huge population growth rate. And I'm saying that not because I think they should, because it is a problem if a society grows. They can grow. The problem is to keep track with development. If you have a population growth rate, annual population growth rate 3.5 per, then you need to keep track with houses, schools, roads, infrastructure, and that's a real problem in Africa. Now let's have a short look on the economics of Uganda being said to be devastated by HIV. Consequences stand to undermine all efforts to promote development. This is actually a graph showing the GDP in Uganda. And below this impressive graph, you can find a recent statement of the government of Uganda, who states Uganda has experienced solid economic growth of 6 to 7%. We can only dream of that in the West per annum over the last decade. Quite inconsistent with a deadly epidemic, I would say. Now, all these forecasts have been based on the HIV prevalence, and I will share some slides and thoughts with you. This is the graph that is published by the government of Uganda, and this is based on the so-called antenatal screening. That is, pregnant women are screened in different sites. What is quite impressive is a huge difference, huge variation between different sites, but it is believed that the prevalence peaked in the early 90s and then came down slowly over the following years. Now, the government of Uganda says the number of infections have fallen sharply because behavioral change, such as increased abstinence, monogamy, a rise to the average age of first sex, reduction in number of sexual partners, and more frequent use of condoms. And because of all this engagement of organizations, a lot of NGOs. Now, coming from a very Catholic country and being faced with 2,000 years of activity of the Catholic Church to reduce sexual activity of the population, and I think we share the conclusion that these 2,000 years of activity of the Catholic Church can be summed up as a total failure in reducing sexual activity of Christian societies. I wonder why these interventions in Uganda should have been more successful. Actually, the Vatican could learn a lot of them, if it were true. Unfortunately, the data are a little bit contradictory to these claims. If you look at data on sexual activity, median age at first intercourse for women is 16.7, no evidence of change over time. Median age at first marriage among women is just before 18 years, fairly stable over the last 30 years. Median age at first birth, no significant change for the last 30 years. Fertility has remained stable, 7 children on average for women. Current contraceptive use in married women is very, very low, 2% for condoms only, but 35% of the married couples have unmet needs for contraception. So not only is this a total failure of the so-called prevention campaigns to change sexual activity, but it is a scandalous ignorance of the actual needs on the ground that is contraception. And there was this question before, how does the HIV prevalence correlate to other sexually transmitted or to truly sexually transmitted diseases? Actually, it's quite interesting. Uganda has never published its figures on syphilis, but all these antenatal screenings, they are done on HIV and on syphilis, and this is just a short overview from South Africa, showing that this is an inverse correlation of HIV prevalence and syphilis, and this inverse correlation can also be found in Thailand, where I did the research, and I had a look on the Uganda data, and again you find an inverse correlation of syphilis and HIV in a geographical distribution, but also over time, indicating that HIV has not very much to do with sexual activity. Now, how can this high HIV prevalence be explained, especially in these antenatal screenings? I just wanted to show you in this respect this wonderful table done by Christine Johnson, where she collected all the evidence of false positive or positive HIV tests. And I just want to draw your attention to those factors which are relevant in an African context: tuberculosis, respiratory tract infection, malaria, and what is very important, pregnancy in multiparous women. Now, I just want to remind you that virtually all HIV prevalence data we have from Africa are coming from antenatal screenings. In a population where women have 7 children on average. Now, on the other hand, pregnancy in multiparous women is a known factor to cause a positive result in an HIV test. So this indicates quite a problem in concerning reliability of these tests. But there are other problems on reliability. This is a citation from a ELISA test from the company Abbott, and they state clearly, at present there is no recognized standard for establishing the presence or absence of antibodies in human blood. Now just think for a second about this statement. They don't say there is some unreliable, we get some unreliable results in some populations. They say there is no standard. In other words, we don't know, the company admits they don't know anyone who has reliably diagnosed HIV antibodies in human bloods. Now, to translate that into a more understandable form, I have translated this wording to pregnancy tests. We are quite familiar with pregnancy tests. Now, imagine you wanted to know whether you're pregnant as a woman or your partner is pregnant, and you go to the pharmacy, and the pharmacist will tell you, now we have a very reliable pregnancy test. And you open the package insert and you read, the company at present admits there is no recognized standard for establishing presence or absence for pregnancy. How would you feel? You would probably think they don't know what they talk about. And this is exactly, has to be, this thinking has to be translated to HIV tests. But it goes further, that there are studies that even admit that the usual HIV tests, ELISA and Western blot, are possibly not sufficient to diagnose HIV in Central Africa. Now, what are we left then to diagnose HIV in Africa? But in most circumstances in Africa, neither ELISA nor Western blot are being used. They use so-called rapid tests. And if you look at the package insert of these rapid tests, they tell you sensitivity and specificity were calculated comparing these rapid tests with a commercially available test, period. No more information giving. It's just as Charles said, it's difficult to stop, but I would like to share a last quote with you. And probably if you would read that quote, you would say, oh, that's quite a rethinking quote, isn't it? I mean, just a correlation between AIDS and HIV, no causation, and a retrovirus referred to as HIV sounds pretty suspicious to a rethinking quote. It's not. It's taken from the product information of an HIV test from the company bioMérieux. And they even admit that there is only a correlation, and we know that causation can never be based on a correlation. Now let's go on to the what we made believe is a distinctive disease called AIDS. What is AIDS in Africa? Now there are various definitions have been published on AIDS, and the most famous one is the so-called Bangui definition published by WHO. And actually the question, if you read these definitions, you wonder, is it really a new disease or is it just a new name for old diseases? And I would like to share with you some citations, some information on this. This is a citation from James Chin. He was responsible at UNAIDS for worldwide AIDS statistics. And he admits, or he says in a publication, reports from AIDS cases were based on very different definitions. Now that's like saying, well, the statistics of flu are based on very different definitions of flu in different countries. He says, well, the CDC definition is used in most developed countries, but in Africa, it's generally it's based on nationally adapted versions of the WHO definition. Now, you have appendicitis or you have a pregnancy and you go to a hospital and say, now we base our diagnosis of a pregnancy on the nationally adapted definition of pregnancy. You would think they are crazy, right? Now, how does this definition look like? This is again from Uganda, and it's no joke. This is the reporting form doctors are considered to complete, and I share with you just the most important parts of this form. You need 2 major signs and 1 minor sign to diagnose a patient as AIDS case in Uganda. 2 minor signs. So just keep in mind that 50% of the population in Uganda have no access to clean drinking water, right? So there's a high chance they have a chronic diarrhea. You have chronic diarrhea, chances are you will lose some weight. Chances are you have some itching somewhere, so you fulfill the criteria of AIDS in Uganda. If you have got tuberculosis, well, you have fever and you have weight loss, and you have cough at least 1 month, so you fulfill the criteria of tuberculosis. Now they specify here in Uganda cough without TB. But people have no possibility to diagnose or exclude TB. So it completely makes no sense at all. And the last aspect I would like to draw your attention to is on this reporting form, there is no space for HIV test. No space. You can't even make a cross somewhere whether an HIV test was done or how the result was. So this clinical definition is based on clinical science, highly unspecific clinical science, explicitly without an HIV test. And this is actually nothing new. This is what Luc Montagnier has said from the very beginning. No one read it, but he published it in his book, saying AIDS has no typical clinical symptoms anyway. But that's exactly what this WHO definition tries to diagnose. And based on this definition, these are the statistics, the numbers that came up in Uganda. Quite a number, not so many actually, AIDS cases if you think about. But what is quite impressive is in 1994 there were, in Uganda alone with 16 to 20 million people, 4,000 organizations engaged against AIDS. And I would like to remind you that still 50% of the population in Uganda have no access to clean drinking water. Very few NGOs have been engaged in the clean drinking water. But it goes even further, and this is a true citation from an annual AIDS report from the neighboring country, Tanzania. They reported 1,320 cases, but they say, out of the total number of cases reported, AIDS cases reported, the Ministry of Health admits they would not strictly even qualify the AIDS definition, which is very similar to the one I just showed you. But they have nevertheless counted them as AIDS cases, just assuming that those who reported them made an omission at the stage of compiling the form. And now, all these data, all these numbers, they are compiled in Geneva, and they are compiled, and that's what you see on the left column, reported AIDS cases. Now in Geneva, the experts, they say, well, we know the reporting on the ground is not very reliable, so we have to estimate unreporting, right? Unreporting. So you see on the second column, they added unreported cases, their estimates. And what you can see over time, the number of unreported estimated cases increased dramatically to the extent of absurdity. And on the right column, I showed you the percentage of unreported cases which were added in Geneva to come up to the so-called total AIDS cases in Africa. And at the end, in the last time period, 97% of what have been told being AIDS cases in Africa were actually added in Geneva for being underreported. And obviously you can't continue. So in the next year, UNAIDS stopped to publish this statistics, and they lumped together HIV/AIDS. They didn't divide anymore between HIV cases, HIV positive and AIDS cases, and they just made a grand total and making it impossible for someone from outside to show how they are summing up or cooking up, as James Chin said. There is a very easy understanding why they did that, and we already heard that they needed more budgets. Now, how do you increase budget? And this is one true slide. It's actually a true slide. It is not online anymore. UNAIDS has unfortunately taken it offline from their homepage, but it was online for quite a while. And they had a meeting in 1999 in Addis Ababa with ministers of finance and economic development of African countries. And they recommended, UNAIDS actually recommended ministers in Africa to what they said, redirect funds from existing projects that could support AIDS, and redirect, that is, take away money from social funds, education, health projects, infrastructure and rural development to give it to HIV/AIDS projects. And that is what you find on the ground. It's not so easy to find a nice statistic like this one from Thailand. That's why I just switched to Thailand. And this shows very nicely how it works. In the beginning, you kick off this. You kick off the whole business with donations. That's the second column. And then you urge the country itself to step in. And in the end, the country itself is forced to pay for something they haven't even asked for in the very beginning. So in the end, you force the countries to spend the scarce resources they have to pay for this HIV/AIDS business. Quite an interesting and obviously successful business case. Now, we already heard about Rakhine district, and I would just give you a short glance about the negative consequences this has on the ground. Rakhine is on the border, as a region on the border of Lake Victoria, and Kyotera is the main city in that village, and there is a multi-million funded research project, latest technology, funded mainly from the United States. And why in Rakhine? Because it was suggested that that's where everything started in the very beginning. And if you leave alone this multi-million research project, you just approach the people, you go to the people. This is the water source for drinking water for the people in Rakhine. And a small detail just to remind you, it's not even fenced off. So it means cattle and all animals share this drinking source with people. And then another detail I would like to share with you, as soon as cattle and animals drink, they defecate. And because obviously the water pole is going down to the water, all their defecation ends up in the drinking water. And it was heartbreaking to talk to these people, because they told me they are given condoms, free condoms, twice a year. And they urged me to give them at least a few $100s just to make this a secure water pole. No one in this village would do that, and that since more than 15 years. Now, if you write all this up, you get into difficult things, difficult discussions. Because we are still being accused of endangering lives in Africa, interestingly, the numbers of people that can be saved from these drugs is decreasing significantly. In 2002 and 2003, in the British Medical Journal, it was estimated that in South Africa alone, 1.7 million people could be saved by drugs. A few years later, in 2008, it was only 303,000 people that apparently could be saved with drugs. But if you question that, if you point to the inconsistencies, and if you point to the dramatic consequences on the ground, that's what you get. That's what we did with Peter Duisberg and Henry Bauer, and we concluded that the huge losses of African lives are unconfirmed, and that's what you get. They withdraw publication. You are not allowed to point to the inconsistencies of the predictions and current situation on the ground. You're not allowed to point to the dangerous consequences of this HIV/AIDS theory on the ground, especially for developing countries. And you are accused, as we have been, to potentially damage global public health. Now, this is in a long tradition, and just how the AIDS establishment is treating anyone who dares to criticize the current held belief. And this was published in Mail and Guardian in South Africa. This is the head of Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières from South Africa, at a demonstration in 2000. He didn't hold this board, One Bullet, One Dissident, but he organized, Médecins Sans Frontières organized that conference. So this is kind of the mental state we are facing. And that is not limited to HIV/AIDS. This has a long tradition. And just to give you one example, a historic example from my home country, Vienna, Ignaz Semmelweis, who discovered the puerperal fever, childbed fever. And he was, when he discovered that the childbed fever was actually transmitted by the hands of doctors because they refused to wash their hands prior to a vaginal examination, he was chased from the hospital and even banned from the city of Vienna because doctors were offended at the suggestion that they should wash their hands. They felt that their social status as gentlemen was inconsistent with the idea that their hands could be unclean. And this is very much the same thinking we are facing now when we point to problems on the ground, that these gentlemen, they feel it is inconsistent with their mission to save the planet, that they could actually do harm. Just a few words on what Africa does not need and what they need. This is a publicity I came across in Malawi. On the left side, you find a publicity for cigarettes, Peter Stuyvesant. On the right side, you find a president who says, AIDS is killing Africa, change your behavior, let us save our country. Now, but I got a little bit confused. I say, well, of course we should save the country, but why would we then make an advertisement for cigarettes, right? I mean, clearly this is about making money, isn't it? So, nothing else. So they make money with cigarettes, and obviously someone is making money with AIDS, otherwise they would not pay for this huge billboard. So Africa doesn't need new names for old diseases, exaggerated estimates for new diseases. Africa doesn't need expensive tests without consequences. Africa doesn't need more of Western morals, double standards, Western fantasisms about African sexuality. And Africa doesn't need campaigns to increase the profit of Western companies. The real problems in Africa are well known, well documented, but they're not as sexy. The real problems are malaria, respiratory infections, tuberculosis, diarrhea, and reproductive health, by the way. Still, abortion is illegal in most countries in Africa. And all this has been published and is well known. For example, here one study that found that malaria in Uganda, malaria was the leading cause of admission and other conditions. And the consequences of this study to find out why people are sick and in Uganda was, in conclusion, preventable and or treatable communicable diseases, mainly those related to poverty and poor hygiene, represent the leading cause of admission and death. That's it. Poverty is not a romantic issue, it's really deadly and killing. And just to remind you about maternal mortality, which is highest in Central Africa, partly because abortion is still illegal there, because the laws of the former colonial power are still enforced. So it's really about fighting poverty, clean drinking water, all what we know. Fighting poverty is what Africa needs. And this was very nicely worded in this letter to the daily newspaper in Uganda, Kampala. A normal reader, just an average reader, he said, most people die from malaria, so give us free mosquito nets instead of condoms and AIDS medicaments. I think that sums up very nicely what is needed, and I thank you very much for your attention.